It should say 4 Carmelite mystics. So interrupt me if there's a problem with the technology. So thank you all for coming tonight. As LJ said, we've had a presentation on Teresa of Avila and then on John of the Cross. The one on John of the Cross, the recording didn't take. I think I will in the future try to do another recording of that, which we can post on. We will post these videos also on the website of the Center for Carmelite Studies. So if you give us a few days after each of these talks, we should be able to post a link there so that you can watch them later if you'd like to. So our 4 Carmelite mystics, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Lawrence of the Resurrection, and Therese of Lisieux. Now, tonight, we're going to be talking about Brother Lawrence, otherwise known as Nicholas Herman. And one of the challenges with Brother Lawrence is that the book known as The Practice of the Presence of God, of which, you know, it contains his material on the practice of the presence of God. It's so short that I could read the whole thing in an hour and a half to you. So how I'm going to present all of this and fill out the time, we'll see how that goes. But if we end early, we end early. That's fine. Hold on one second here. And hopefully those who are at the old link will know there should be a message there telling them how to get to this present link. So we'll see if they show up. But let's begin with a prayer. And if we're talking about the presence of God, we can hardly do better than Psalm 139, which I think most of us know. But I will read this now slowly and we can pray it together. O Lord, you search me and you know me. You know my resting and my rising. You discern my purpose from afar. You mark when I walk or lie down. All my ways lie open to you. Before ever a word is on my tongue, you know it, O Lord, through and through. Behind and before you besiege me, your hand ever laid upon me. Too wonderful for me, this knowledge, too high beyond my reach. Oh, where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your face? If I climb the heavens, you are there. If I lie in the grave, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn and dwell at the sea's furthest end, even there your hand would lead me, your right hand would hold me fast. If I say, let the darkness hide me, and the light around me be night, even darkness is not dark for you, and the night is as clear as the day. For it was you who created my being, knit me together in my mother's womb. I thank you for the wonder of my being, for the wonders of all your creation. Already you knew my soul. My body held no secret from you when I was being fashioned in secret and molded in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw all of my actions. They were all of them written in your book. Every one of my days was decreed before one of them came into being. To me, how mysterious your thoughts, the sum of them not to be numbered. If I count them, they are more than the sand. To finish, I must be eternal like you. Oh, search me, God, and know my heart. Oh, test me and know my thoughts. See that I follow not the wrong path, and lead me in the path of life eternal. Our Lady of Mount Carmel, pray for us. Okay, this is just to remind you then that during these presentations on the 4 Carmelite mystics, I'm following the understanding of Bernard McGinn that mysticism is that part or element of Christian belief and practice that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the effect of what the mystics themselves have described as a direct and transformative presence of God. So we're focusing on the theme of presence in all of these Carmelite mystics. And as I've said each time, this fits well with with Carmelite spirituality, because Carmelites have always recognized that our calling is to stand in the presence of the living God, like Elijah, who's our spiritual father. And so we're looking at Carmelite mystics for what they tell us about living in God's presence today. So before I start on Brother Lawrence, though, I thought I would give you a little pop quiz. Of course, you don't have to. You can write down your answer. You don't have to speak it out, but just think about it. If you've been paying attention the previous two conferences, or if you know something about Carmelite spirituality. Suppose you were on a Carmelite quiz show and you were asked the following questions. What would your answer be? First question, which famous Carmelite talked about, quote, throwing oneself headlong into the arms of infinite mercy and being led more by God's love than by fear of his judgments? Who spoke of serving God in the littlest things, even picking up a straw out of pure love for God? Think about it. Could it be Therese of Lisieux? She's the one we'll be talking about next week. We know in the last lines of her famous Story of a Soul, she writes, even though I had on my conscience all the sins that can be committed, I would go, my heart broken with sorrow, and throw myself into Jesus' arms, for I know how much he loves the prodigal child. I go to him with confidence and love. So it sounds like Therese. So let's see, we might take that as a possible answer. Which famous Carmelite made faith their principal virtue and prayed, Lord, give more space and room to the faculties of my soul so that I can give greater expression to your love, or sustain me by your omnipotence, for otherwise I would be consumed by the flames of your love? Could it be John of the Cross? We know he wrote that famous poem, O living flame of love that tenderly wounds my soul in its deepest center. Since you are now no longer oppressive, now consummate if it be your will, tear through the veil of this sweet encounter. So John talks about this being inflamed with God's love. Which famous Carmelite wrote that adoring God in truth means recognizing him for what he is and recognizing ourselves for what we are? Could it be Teresa of Avila? Remember, Teresa says, in our works, we should attribute to God what is his and to ourselves what is ours. Once I was pondering why our Lord was so fond of the virtue of humility, and this thought came to me. It is because God is supreme truth, and to be humble is to walk in truth. So Teresa talks about that we need to recognize who God is and who we are in order to grow in prayer. Which famous Carmelite said on their deathbed, I'm doing what I will do for all eternity. I'm blessing God, I'm praising God, I'm adoring him, I'm loving him with my whole heart. Could it be one of those that we've already mentioned? Could it be maybe Elizabeth of the Trinity, who also talks a lot about the presence of God? Think of your answers. Well, of course, those were all trick questions, because the correct answer is Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. He said all of those things, and I think that's just one small indication of how well he fits into our Carmelite tradition, even though many people don't seem to realize that he's a Carmelite. They talk about him as a monk. No, he was a Carmelite friar, or they think of him as something else. Sometimes you'll see him represented in a Franciscan habit, but he was a Carmelite. And so I think it's unfortunate that he's not better known within the order or among Catholics in general. And I think it's time for Catholics and Carmelites to give him his due. So Brother Lawrence is linked forever with the quote, the practice of the presence of God, which is the title of a classic spiritual text bearing his name. But paradoxically, Brother Lawrence himself never wrote a book, as Therese never did, really. We'll see next week. Instead, what's come down to us is a collection of sayings, letters, and conversations with Brother Lawrence that were put together after his death by his friend, Abbé Joseph de Beaufort in Paris. This Abbé Joseph was the vicar general, the cardinal of who became the Archbishop of Paris in 1695. So Abbé Joseph was obviously a man of some influence and importance in French ecclesiastical circles. And that's going to become significant later on when Brother Lawrence's name gets dragged into a doctrinal fight over what's called semi-quietism, which I'll explain briefly later. But not much is known about Brother Lawrence beyond what's contained in this book that Beaufort compiled. Almost all the other records were apparently destroyed during the French Revolution, when the friars were expelled from Paris and their archives were lost. This was the back door of the monastery where Brother Lawrence lived in Paris. And the reason it says Hic ceciderunt here is because it was also during the French Revolution used as a prison for clergy. By that time, the Carmelites had been expelled. But on, I think it was September 2nd, 1792, there was a massacre where a crowd came and dragged out the clergy who were being imprisoned there and slaughtered them. So this is where they fell. That's what Hic ceciderunt means. So it's the spot has historical importance as well. So Father Conrad de Meester, who's the one who put together this critical edition of Brother Lawrence, he searched everywhere for material on Brother Lawrence, and he found nothing really. Couldn't discover where he's buried. There are no relics of Brother Lawrence and no pictures of him really. All of those are artist recreations, and no autographs even. But Father Conrad tried to launch Brother Lawrence's cause for canonization. We'll see how far that goes. But as far as I'm concerned, it may be just as well if it never happens, because many Protestants love Brother Lawrence who don't have much love for Catholic saints, but they found Brother Lawrence to be a wonderful spiritual guide. So maybe he's more credible to them if he remains Brother Lawrence rather than Saint Brother Lawrence. So, but I think I have no doubt about it, Lawrence's holiness. So let me tell you a bit about his life. And yeah, okay. I'm just taking a real quick look at, yeah, good. Nobody's having a problem, I guess, with hearing.
No problems right now, brothers. No problems right now, Father Stephen.
Very good. If it freezes up or something, then we'll have to see what happens. Okay, let me tell you a little about Brother Lawrence's life then. He was born in 1614 in Erimenil. Now, pardon my French. My French accent is terrible. But it's a small town near the larger town of Lunéville in Lorraine, which is now a part of France. And the family name was Herman, and he was baptized Nicholas. So sometimes on editions of Practice of the Presence of God, you'll see Nicholas Herman rather than Brother Lawrence. His parents, they know his parents' name, Dominic and Louise. They were devout, though everyone assumes they must have been poor because there's no evidence that Lawrence came from a privileged background. And as far as we know, he led a fairly ordinary childhood. This is you can see this is a picture of Erimenil from 1914, 1915. Not a very large French village. So nothing remarkable about his childhood has been recorded. We don't know whether he had any brothers or sisters. We don't know what kind of education he received, probably very little. But at 18, he became a soldier for Lorraine in the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, which was, I'm not an expert on this, but it was a battle over the balance of power in Europe. And they describe it as one of the bloodiest wars in European history. In today's France, Lorraine is a region in the northeast section bordering Germany. But during the 30 Years' War, it was being fought over. The wars of religion were still going on in a way between Catholics and Protestants. And France was trying to keep itself from being encircled by Habsburgs in Spain and Austria and so on. And the Holy Roman Empire was still there and so on. So it was quite a ruthless war. So he enlisted around 1632, but he was soon captured by German troops. I have German in quotes because modern Germany didn't yet exist, but that would, and he was sentenced to death because they thought he was a spy, but somehow he was able to convince his captors that he was innocent, and he was released. Then he went back into combat, and he was wounded during a siege at Rambouillet. I guess that's how you say it, in 1635. So he went home to his parents to recuperate and to reevaluate his life. And you think of the number of Catholic saints who've done that, like Francis of Assisi, had a disillusioning experience in combat. Ignatius of Loyola, after he was wounded, he went back to recuperate. You know how that he had his conversion then when he had nothing to read, but he started reading Lives of the Saints, and they really struck him. So Nicholas is at home then recuperating. Because of all the looting and violence and so on that was characteristic of the 30 Years' War, we wonder if this young Nicholas might have participated in some of the bad behavior of the troops. Because later in life, he's going to talk about the quote unquote disorders of his youth, or quote unquote the sins of his past life. Now, he doesn't go into any detail, so we don't know what he's referring to, but it wouldn't be surprising if a soldier caught up in that 30 Years' War did some things he wasn't proud of. De Beaufort, in his eulogy that he wrote for Brother Lawrence, he writes that Nicholas, quote, often relived the perils of his military service, the vanity and corruption of the times, the instability of other people, the treason of an enemy, and the infidelity of friends. So we don't know what that's all about exactly, but his thoughts now turn to the service of God. So he's thinking about what he's going to do with his life. Didn't have much of a glorious military career. And actually, there's an interesting thing. He says that at the age of 18, he had a very significant religious experience. And this is before he's becoming a soldier, or at the age at which he became at which he enlisted. Again, de Beaufort says, I saw Brother Lawrence for the first time, and he told me that God had granted him a special grace of conversion at the age of 18 when he was still in the world. One day in winter, while he was looking at a tree stripped of its leaves, and he realized that in a little while its leaves would reappear, followed by its flowers and fruit, he received a profound insight into God's providence that has never been erased from his soul. This insight completely freed him from the world and gave him such a love for God that he could not say it had increased during the more than 40 years that had passed. So we're not, I mean, the timing of that is a little unclear, but early in life anyway, he had this profound religious experience. And I think it's fascinating that what triggered this experience in this lifelong search for God was an experience of nature, and a very ordinary experience for most of us. In fact, this time of year, I think we're all seeing the trees now coming back to life and so on. Would that would affect us in the same way that it affected Brother Lawrence, because it made a remarkable impression on him. So again, Beaufort tells us again in the eulogy that it was only after intense reflection, inner struggles, sighs, and tears that, overcome by the power of eternal truths, he firmly resolved to devote himself to the practice of the gospel and to follow in the footsteps of his uncle, a holy discalced Carmelite. This uncle was his mother's brother, Jean, who had entered the Discalced Carmelites as a lay brother in 1635 when our hero was about 24 years old. And his uncle was named Brother Nicholas of the Conception. It's interesting that his brother Jean got the name Nicholas. Nicholas got the name Lawrence. And that's how it is in religious life. You end up changing names. And that is an engraving of what the Carmelite monastery would have looked like with its church back in Lawrence's time. So perhaps that's where his uncle joined. But as it turned out, our Nicholas, who would be Lawrence, didn't follow his uncle into the Carmelites right away. So we're continuing with the biography now. We've seen his time up down. Now we're going to see how he joins the Carmelites. So first of all, his first step was he thought maybe he should be a hermit. So he went to stay with a wealthy gentleman who was living in solitude. But Nicholas realized that that's not his calling. He said, de Beaufort tells us that he noticed joy, sadness, peace, disturbance, fervor, distraction, trust, and despondency right one after the other in his heart. In other words, he was feeling instability and he couldn't settle down to the hermit life. And I think a lot of people have that experience. You know, in theory, being a hermit sounds like a very devout thing to do, but not everybody's cut out for it, and you can find yourself kind of lost in that way of life. It's a very special calling, and it wasn't for Lawrence. And so he began to doubt the validity of his way, and he's looking, as de Beaufort tells us, he was looking for a community that, founded as it was, not on the shifting sands of passing devotion, but on the sturdy rock of Jesus Christ, the foundation of all religious life, would strengthen him against the instability of his conduct. So he needed a community where there was a structure. He realized that. That's some self-knowledge there. And we hear that for a time he served as the valet of a Monseigneur de Fubé, but he describes himself as a clumsy oaf who broke everything. So he wasn't very good as a valet either. So that career didn't work either. So here we have this young man with a military career already behind him, who he's got the best intentions in the world, but he can't seem to find his place or settle down. He's good-hearted, but he's not very well educated, not particularly talented. He lacks stability and self-discipline. So he's eagerly searching for something that will give meaning and structure to his life and help him serve God. And this is what he's going to find in the Carmelites. So in mid-June of 1640, at the age of 26, he enters the Discalced Carmelite community on the Rue de Vaugirard in Paris as a lay brother. And in mid-August, he receives the habit and his religious name, Lawrence of the Resurrection. Again, this is a drawing of those back steps that you saw earlier. That would have been the back steps of the monastery there. During his 2-year novitiate, he would have attended certain formation classes with the clerics, the ones who were training to be priests, and some other classes to train brothers in their specific tasks and future duties. In those days, often if you were an older vocation, if you didn't have the educational background and so on, and you joined religious life, you would often be a brother rather than a priest. there were certain, I mean, to become a priest, you had to learn Latin, you had to do certain other things, which probably would have been a challenge for Lawrence. So he's a lay brother, Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. And he tells us, again, there's another engraving of the Carmelite monastery and church there, that he was expecting to be skinned alive for his awkwardness and imperfections. In other words, he thought it would be really tough, but God had fooled him, for he experienced only satisfaction. This led him to tell God frequently, "You've tricked me." So in a certain sense, he found religious life very much to his liking. He felt at home there. But he's still having inner struggles, we'll see. He made his solemn profession, took his final promises on August 14, 1642, at the age of 28, and he was put to work as the monastery cook for 15 years. But gradually he developed a limp, and his leg began to give him increasing trouble, maybe from the wound he received years earlier as a soldier. And so they reassigned him to a job where he could sit in the monastery sandal shop. And he had other responsibilities in the monastery too. He had to make shopping trips for the community. For example, he had to travel 800 kilometers to buy the wine for the community, or another 600-kilometer trip. Again, you see in that picture there, people don't seem to know what kind of a religious Lawrence was, because that's not a Carmelite habit that he's wearing there. I don't know what sort of habit that is exactly. It's not exactly a Franciscan habit either, but it's just some sort of generic religious habit. But so as a lay brother in the community, he would have had the responsibility of greeting visitors, tending to beggars at the door, negotiating with workers, running errands, helping to beg money for the community, and so on. So it wasn't just a matter of cooking or of making sandals, but you were kind of one-man hospitality team for the community. You had to deal with all the outsiders. And he continues that now until he's almost 80 and dies in 1691, a century after the death of John of the Cross. So externally, his life was very ordinary, the same as any other Carmelite lay brother of that time. And it's good to know too that at this time, France and especially Paris was the center of a spiritual revival. Everybody was reading Teresa, the mystics. They were interested in contemplation and so on. And the Discalced Carmelite Church there was the first in Paris dedicated to St. Joseph. And you can see the church as it is today there. That's the steeple there behind these buildings in the front. And now it's part of the Catholic University in Paris called the Institut Catholique. They incorporated what's left of the old monastery and the monastery church, and then they built these buildings that are in front of them. So by the 1670s, and Lawrence is still there now, the monastery, which was a house of studies for the Discalced Carmelite friars in Paris, was expanding because vocations were increasing, so that there were about 100 friars living in the community. So it's good to realize that, Brother Lawrence wasn't a hermit. He didn't go off and live this practice of the presence of God on a mountaintop. He was living in a large urban monastery. He was dealing with all the people who came to the door. He was counseling sisters from the nearby communities, and lots of other people were coming for advice. He was cooking for 100. I don't know how many cooks they had, but if he had to do that every day, that's not an easy job by any means. There was construction going on near the monastery. So he's living in a very busy setting, and he's got a very externally busy life. He's not leading a kind of a quiet, contemplative hermit life. Now, Lawrence tells us that during his first years in religious life, he went through a kind of a dark night experience. And again, de Beaufort describes this. He says, Lawrence had been greatly troubled in spirit during these early years, thinking that he was surely damned, and no one in the world could have convinced him otherwise. But he reasoned in this way: I entered religious life solely for the love of God, and I have tried to act for him alone. Whether I be damned or saved, I always want to act purely for his love. At least I can say that until I die, I will do whatever I can to love him. And since that time, he thought about neither heaven nor hell. His whole life was nothing but freedom and continual joy. He placed his sins between God and himself, as if to tell God that he didn't deserve his graces, but that did not stop God from filling him with them. So, he was having, as many in this age did. Francis de Sales went through a kind of a similar crisis, worrying about his own salvation and so on, and getting relief when he realized that he just had to leave that in the hands of God and just continue loving God as best he could. Now, that was a turning point in Lawrence's life and spirituality, but his description of it was caught up after his death in controversies about the nature of what does it mean to love God purely? What is pure love of God? Whether it was wrong to seek God for the sake of your own salvation. You had some authors of that period, like Archbishop Fenelon and his protege, Madame Guyon, who were arguing that your love of God isn't really pure love if you still care about whether you're going to heaven or hell, because that's a selfish concern. You should just love God. You remember, and even in the act of contrition, we say, I detest all my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but most of all, because they have offended you who are all good and deserving of all my love. In the act of contrition, we sort of say, that the real reason we're sorry for our sins is out of love for God, not just punishment. Now, when that became controversial, because it pushed to an extreme, that can sound like saying, well, I can do whatever I want because I'm not worried about heaven or hell. I'm just going to be loving. And we know that kind of attitude can get you into a lot of trouble. But when the controversies came, Fenelon, Madame Guyon, and so on quoted Brother Lawrence in their defense, about what he said about having gone through this spiritual crisis. And so that's going to put Lawrence under a cloud later when the views of Fenelon and Madame Guyon are condemned, some of them. But we have to remember that what Lawrence was struggling with, it wasn't a theological theory, but it was a serious personal crisis. He finally realized that the way to conquer his obsessive fear of damnation was not by making greater efforts to be perfect, because he realized he could never do enough to earn his own salvation. So Lawrence finally realizes that everything depends not on his own merits, but on God's mercy. So he simply had to throw himself into God's merciful arms and love God as best he could and leave all concern about his fate in God's hands. And once he was able to entrust everything to God like that, things became simple, and he had great peace. Now, I think what is timely about that for us today? I think perhaps today people don't worry as much about hell as they used to in the past. We worry about many other things: money, food, clothing, our academic achievements, our career, our spiritual progress, whatever. And basically, these all boil down to, what can I do to avoid the possibility of something bad happening to me? What can I do to make myself better and more secure so that everyone, including God, will love me and care for me? And the simple answer to that in the end is there's nothing I can do. Ultimately, this is totally beyond my control. But I'm never going to have any peace until I can leave things in God's hands, until I can learn to entrust the future to God and just do what I can to serve him in the present moment. And I think that was what Lawrence discovered for himself. That's very different from apathy or fatalism. In fact, I'll work all the harder at the task God gives me, but I'll have more peace and security because I realize that the outcome and the value doesn't ultimately depend on my shaky efforts, but on the strength of a loving God. So in that respect, we might say that Lawrence is in some ways a kind of forerunner of Therese's little way. And you see the quote there, we ought not to be weary of doing little things for the love of God, who regards not the greatness of the work, but the love with which it is performed. And that's what St. Teresa had said before. She said, God looks not so much at the greatness of our actions, but as at the love with which they are done. Okay. So let me pause there for a moment. I'll stop the share and see if there are any questions so far. And the next point is I want to get into talking about how does he understand the practice of the presence of God? Are there any questions at this point, LJ?
I'm going to ask folks, if you have a question, to type it in the chat. That'll be a lot easier. So we're just waiting to see if anybody wants to type a question into the chat.
Okay. If not, we'll just continue on.
Oh, Father Stephen, one
Okay.
question.
Okay.
More of a question about the program. Would there be a way you could share the slides from all of your presentations?
I'm a little cautious about doing that because I don't have the copyright to any of those images or anything. But I mean, since they'll be available as a Zoom recording, would that be sufficient? Yeah. I'm hoping that would be sufficient for people because you can replay it and you can look at the slides that way, if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, it's just that I'm just not sure about copyright issues and all that kind of stuff. It gets complicated. So.
Okay, here's a question.
Yeah.
This is from Lisa. Lisa asks, were people of Brother Lawrence's time, in your view, more intent about avoiding hell or having hearts filled with love for God?
Well, again, I think it would depend on the individual. But remember, I mean, 17th century France, this is also the time of Jansenism and that kind of, concern about only a few who will be saved, and a kind of rigorism in Catholic spirituality and so on. So I would say it was probably more emphasized in preaching and popular piety and so on than it is today. Some people might say it needs to be revived again, but yeah, I would think culturally anyway, probably at that time there was much more concern about that than you notice with people today. Yeah.
All right, one more question.
Okay,
this is from
after
Barbara.
that, then I'll go back. Yeah.
All right. Barbara says, do you think the groundwork for his relationship with God was, as was stated earlier, when he said that God had fooled him?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things about Lawrence is he's kind of very informal with God. I mean, he has a great respect for God, of course, but he's able to kind of talk with him like he would a friend. And so he's sort of, I think I mean, Teresa had somewhat the same experience. She was expecting religious life to be very hard for her to get adjusted to, but both of them found that they fit into it rather well. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's an important ground for his later development. I think once he gets beyond this obsessive concern about his own salvation and is settling in his vocation as a Carmelite brother, I think that his spiritual life starts to take off. So so I guess I would say, yeah, in some way that's probably true. So thank you for the questions. Let me continue now with talking about his themes. Okay. Okay, are you seeing the slides again?
Yes, we are.
Okay, we'll keep going on. Okay, so his most important discovery, and what he's best known for, is early in religious life, he discovers what he calls the practice of the presence of God. And he defines it as taking delight in and becoming accustomed to God's divine company, speaking humbly and talking lovingly with him at all times, at every moment, without rule or system, and especially in times of temptation, suffering, spiritual dryness, disgust, and even unfaithfulness and sin, so that every thought, every action becomes a way of carrying on little conversations with God. Now, Lawrence, as a religious 14th century France, getting formation in religious life and how to pray and so on, he found at the time there were lots of Catholic books telling you how to do discursive meditation. And that was a popular prayer form at the time. And it was popular in 16th century Spain as well. And Teresa and John of the Cross were familiar with this. And in discursive meditation, classically, you settle down, you take some gospel scene or truth of the faith or something like that, and you kind of imagine it vividly, like you think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. You imagine it, you place yourself in the scene, you observe, who's here, what's happening, and all that. What is it saying to me? Then you start some kind of conversation with the Lord in that setting. Then you end with good resolutions and so on. And often these methods, though, became very highly structured, that you had to go through a whole number of steps in a certain order to do discursive meditation properly. But for Lawrence, as for many people, that it was just too complicated. Like Therese, Lawrence wanted a simple and short approach. So he says, I renounced for the sake of his love everything other than God. I adored him as often as I could, keeping in mind his holy presence and recalling him as many times as I was distracted. I had some trouble doing this exercise, but continued in spite of all the difficulties I encountered, without getting disturbed or anxious when I was involuntarily distracted. I was as faithful to this practice during my activities as I was during my periods of mental prayer. So he goes on to say that, as was his experience, this practice can seem hard at first, but if you stick with it, you eventually build up a habit so that you're living continually in the presence of God. You're continually mindful that God is with you and within you. So, I mean, that was the whole sum and substance then of his prayer method, of just trying to keep himself aware that God was with him, God was present with him, and doing that through, whatever means he could use, short conversations, just turning his attention to God throughout all his activities and so on. So Lawrence's whole spirituality then is built on this theological truth that we've been talking about, that God is always present to us and always present within us, whether we're aware of it or not. And so he wants to cultivate a constant attention to that presence. And when we do that, he says our prayer life becomes very simple. And what we do in the time of quiet prayer is no different than what we're doing all day long. We're trying to bring to our minds and hearts, we're trying to bring them constantly back to God. We want to constantly converse with God. We act very simply and directly, doing everything for love of him. So that's, in a nutshell, the practice of the presence of God. Not easy, especially at the beginning, but very simple. And you see the quote there. He says, I've abandoned all particular forms of devotion, all prayer techniques. My only prayer practice is attention. I carry on a habitual, silent, and secret conversation with God that fills me with overwhelming joy. So just trying always to remain in the presence of God. So he says this practice has many names. He says that you could call it simple act, or clear and distinct knowledge of God, or indistinct view, or general and loving awareness of God. I mean, these were all terms that were floating around at the time. Other times he says he calls it just attention to God, or silent conversation with God, or trust in God, or the soul's life and peace. He says they're all, for him, they're all synonyms of the same thing. So there are many ways of describing it. If you don't like the phraseology, the practice of the presence of God, call it something else. But the point is that just trying to always live before the face of the living God, try to remain in God's presence at every moment. And it's not easy to talk at length about this, because you know what Brother Lawrence says about it is so short and simple, and he repeats himself so often. He writes to a sister, he says, "You'll tell me that I always say the same thing. It's true. I know of no other means more appropriate than this practice." Or he says, "If I were a preacher, I would preach nothing but the practice of the presence of God. And if I were a spiritual director, I would recommend it to everyone, for I believe there's nothing so necessary or so easy." And I like this verse here from Denise Levertov, who's a modern contemporary poet. She wrote on Brother Lawrence, I'll read this. "Everything faded, thinning to nothing, beside the light which bathed and warmed, the presence your being had opened to, where it shone. There life was, and abundantly. It touched your dullest task, and the task was easy. Joyful, absorbed, you practiced the presence of God as a musician practices, hour after hour, his art. A stone before the carver, you entered into yourself." And I think that's a nice description of what it was all about. So how do we practice this presence of God? Well, Lawrence says the first means to acquire the presence of God is a great purity of life, which he means that, you know, we have to be living our Christian vocation, which I think it shows that this practice is not just an intellectual exercise for reducing anxieties or whatever. So, I mean, it would be a mistake if you're living a life of crime, for example, to think that you could continue your criminal career and just practice the presence of God on the side to quiet your nerves. It would be a mistake to think that you can practice the presence of God while being careless about the rest of your Christian life. No, I mean, this is supposed to accompany a sincere effort on our part to live according to the gospel. At the same time, Lawrence says that it doesn't mean you have to already be a saint to practice this. He says you don't become a saint in a day, and this practice will help you grow in holiness. But we need to be making a sincere effort to acquire virtue, to grow in holiness, and so on. Otherwise, this practicing the presence of God is going to be kind of empty. What does it mean if you're not taking it seriously in how you live your life? He says the second means is great fidelity to the practice of this presence and to the fostering of this awareness of God within, which must always be performed gently, humbly, and lovingly, without giving in to disturbance or anxiety. So he says a number of times, don't try to force it. And you know, it's not always going to work, and you'll be distracted some days and so on, but be gentle about it, but persistent. Keep coming back to this practice of the presence of God. And it's how you build up any good habit. I mean, a habit takes time through repeated effort. You know, and if you want to learn how to swim, you have to practice. If you want to play an instrument, you have to practice, and so on. We have to practice habits of charity and patience and so on. They don't just happen all at once, but we acquire them through faithful repetition. So as I say, you don't impose this artificially or by force, but you try to acquire this habit gently, lovingly, naturally. Lawrence says we have to take special care that this inner awareness of God's presence, no matter how brief it may be, precedes all our activities, that it accompanies them from time to time, and that we complete all of them in the same way. So, I mean, we can't be constantly thinking only about God. But throughout the day, we can be pausing from time to time to remind ourselves that we're doing this in God's presence, that we're doing this for God, and so on. Uh, it's good to take that kind of spiritual break in the midst of busy activities. Now, how we do that is going to depend on our work and our vocation. I like this little saying of Lawrence. He said when he was cooking, he said, I flip my little omelet in the frying pan for the love of God. And when it's done, if I have nothing to do, I prostrate myself on the floor and adore my God who gave me the grace to do it. After which I get up happier than a king. When I can do nothing else, it is enough for me to pick up a straw from the ground for the love of God. So you can do this with whatever you're called to do. I mean, as you're doing it, if you're a cook, advert to God, remind yourself that you're doing this for God in God's presence as you're going through the process. So it's really suitable for any vocation or task in God's service. If you're a student, for example, Lawrence would encourage you during studies to pause now and then and remember that God's with you. Maybe talk with the Lord about what you're studying. If you're a parent, have a simple conversation with God about your family. If you're doing your ministry, glorify God for this opportunity to meet Christ and his little ones, and so on. In other words, you can turn everything you do into a prayer, into a little conversation with the Lord. Lawrence says, you need not shout out. He's closer to us than we may think. We do not always have to be in a church to be with God. We can make of our hearts an oratory where we can withdraw from time to time to converse with him there, gently, humbly, and lovingly. And to me, that there's a very strong Carmelite echo there, because I think I said in the very first conference, Carmelites have a rule which says that we're supposed to stay in our cell meditating on the law of the Lord day and night and keeping watch at prayer unless attending to some other duty. Well, I mean, you can't always do that practically when you have other responsibilities, but you can keep a cell in your heart. You can keep a little hermitage there, an oratory, where you can from time to time go within and be aware of God's presence. So it's kind of an internalized hermitage in our souls. Lawrence says, don't get discouraged or upset when we fail. He says, in the beginning, you may often think that you're wasting your time. And he says, I had some trouble doing this exercise, but continued in spite of all the difficulties I encountered without getting disturbed or anxious when I was involuntarily distracted. I was as faithful to this practice during my activities as I was during my periods of mental prayer. For at every moment, all the time, in the most intense periods of my work, I banished and rid from my mind everything that was capable of taking the thought of God away from me. So I think getting, if we're trying to practice the presence of God, we shouldn't get too upset about our failures, because if we focus on our failures, that's shifting the attention to us and away from God. Just let that go and go back to the practice. We gently return to the practice of his presence. And the quote there, he says, he's talking again about forming the habit of conversing continually with God. There's an interesting thing he says there about persevere at every moment, especially in times of temptation, even infidelity and sin. And you might think that, well, if you're in a serious state of sin, that's not the time to be practicing the presence of God, because you've alienated yourself from God. But like Teresa, he believes that this kind of prayer is never the problem; it's always the solution. And remembering the presence of God might be the first step on the road to recovery and repentance and so on. So even in serious sin, don't despair, but just come back to God's presence, ask forgiveness, and so on. Lawrence says, in his own experience, when he realized that he'd sinned, he said he just acknowledged his sin simply and humbly, and then returned to practicing trying to do everything for the love of God. he would say, well, Lord, I'm very sorry for sinning, but, you see what I'm like if you don't give me your grace. So please help me. And I'm going to try to stay faithful and so on. Yeah, you see the quote there. When he had failed in his duty, he only confessed his fault, saying to God, I shall never do otherwise if you leave me to myself. It is you who must hinder my falling and mend what is amiss. Then after that, Lawrence gave himself no further uneasiness about it. Now, sometimes commentators have seized on that and said, well, didn't he go to confession and so on? Well, yes, of course, he did all of those things. As a religious, that would be expected. But I think he's just talking about, the just person falls 7 times a day. So we always have sins to repent of. Now, Lawrence also says one of the helpful means for reminding ourselves of the presence of God is what we used to call aspirations. When I was growing up, they would talk about aspirative prayer. And these are short prayers, often taken from the scriptures, that we can repeat as needed. Lawrence gives examples like, my God, I'm completely yours, or God of love, I love you with all my heart, or Lord, fashion me according to your heart, and so on. Other Carmelites like John of St. Sampson have also encouraged these aspirative prayers very much as well. And you may know that in the Eastern Church, Eastern Christian churches, there's the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This is a short, easy to remember prayer that you can repeat over and over again as needed throughout the day. Lawrence says basically find the phrase that works best for you and avoid anything so complicated that it's going to distract you. That's why normally the shorter the better. If it's a complicated aspirative prayer that you have to think about to remember, that's just going to make things more difficult for you. But something simple, Jesus, mercy, whatever it might be. Lord, I love you. Lawrence also says it, and this was part of the question about I had earlier that sounds a lot like John of the Cross. He insisted that we have to enliven our faith. And de Beaufort says that several times that faith was the principal virtue among all those that Brother Lawrence possessed. Of course, not a faith exclusive of hope and love, but faith for Lawrence was very important. And faith is, I think, faith in God, trusting in God's love, and so on. And Lawrence, although he doesn't go into the kind of detail that John does, he seems to follow John on the cross in recognizing that God transcends all our particular feelings, images, and concepts. And so to reach God, we have to be willing to let go of everything less than God. Lawrence says to de Beaufort, he says, instead of taking faith as our rule and guide, we amuse ourselves with insignificant, constantly changing devotions. This way of faith is the mind of the church and is all we need to reach perfection. And he goes on to say, we have to place all our trust in God and let go of all our cares, including a multitude of private devotions, very good in themselves, but often carried out for the wrong reason. For these devotions are nothing more than a means to arrive at the end. If then we are with the one who is our end by this practice of the presence of God, it is certainly useless to return to the means. In other words, if all of these different devotions and pictures and practices and so on we have are meant to try to remind us of the presence of God and make us attentive to God's presence. And if that's the goal, if we're already there, aware of God's presence, why complicate things with all these devotions? Now, again, he's in a religious community. I'm sure they had all of the devotions that were customary in religious communities at the time. So, he's not saying that these devotions are useless, but for him, he kind of kept them to a minimum and tried to put most of his focus on this practice of the presence of God. And I think he would say, it's whatever you do, keep it simple. If you have all these devotions that you have to say every day and in particular order at a certain time and all that kind of stuff. Your life gets tied up with those various rituals and so on. And instead of kind of focusing on just being, staying, cultivating that friendship with the God who's present to us. So what does he say happens if we're faithful to the practice of the presence of God? Well, as we've seen, eventually attentiveness to the presence of God becomes habitual, and it brings great stability and peace in our life and in our prayer. He writes to his spiritual director. He says, I gave up all devotions and prayers that were not required, and I devoted myself exclusively to remaining always in his holy presence. I keep myself in his presence by simple attentiveness. This sometimes results in interior and often exterior contentment and joy so great that I have to perform childish acts, appearing more like folly than devotion, to control them and keep them from showing outwardly. In other words, he was feeling the presence of God so intently that sometimes he had to do something kind of strange to not to lose control of himself. He'd become so accustomed to the presence of God that he couldn't get away from him. That's to quote something that Teresa says. When you're faithful to this prayer practice. So he says, because of this practice of the presence of God, it became so habitual, so constant that the periods of mental prayer were not at all different for him than other times. And so he just, during prayer times, he just continued to practice the presence of God. And he tells de Beaufort, he says, actually, he's more closely united to God during his ordinary activities than when he put them aside to do his retreat exercises, which generally left him in great aridity. I mean, again, that sort of reminds you a bit of Therese. Therese said that she found the communal prayer, saying the liturgy of the hours and all of that, was usually very dry for her, but she had her most intense experiences of God and her greatest insights outside the times of prayer. And but probably they wouldn't have happened if she hadn't tried to be faithful to to those community acts that were nevertheless were dry for her. So we have this Lawrence now. He used to worry about everything. Now he no longer worries about anything. He has just tremendous peace and joy. So living in the presence of God helps him to live in the present moment without undue concern about the past or the future. So living in the presence, in the present. Now he admits that not many people maybe will reach the level of this practice that he did. I mean, he'd been at it for so many years. But he says God wants to give it, and if we're faithful to the practice of the presence of God, he'll grant us, quote, a manner and state that greatly resembles this simple awareness. So maybe not everyone will be blessed with such an intense sense of God's presence as he had, but they'll have something like it, he believes, if they're faithful to this practice. So before I go to the conclusion, then let me stop the share again and see if there are some questions.
There are some questions, Father Stephen.
Okay, yeah.
Here's the first one. Do you use this particular prayer practice? I mean, I think she means you. This is from Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's asking if you, Father Stephen, use this particular prayer practice. And if so, what is your personal experience of it?
Well, I try to, but I wouldn't encourage anyone to have my prayer life, because I think it's every day it's a struggle. But I mean, I think as you grow older, your spiritual life tends to get simpler, and I think it's very wise of Lawrence to advise us to try to keep a sense of God's presence throughout the day. I don't always practice it very well because I can get very anxious and distraught and worried about things and so on. But then I try to take a deep breath and remind myself of this practice. But I'm not Brother Lawrence. But it seems a very congenial approach to me. I find it very, very attractive.
All right, one more. Actually, I'm sorry. More of a comment. Barbara says, would it not be just being with God as just as two friends or lovers are with each other and yet say nothing but just being together? And then she continues, I once heard it put this way, if you were in love with someone, would you let them know your love by reciting Shakespeare?
Um, I don't know. I probably wouldn't, but reciting Shakespeare. But yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's, we were talking last time about how John of the Cross sees how we grow in the spiritual life through these different stages, that it can be very intense and very busy in the early stages of our spiritual life. But as we grow to know God better, there will be times when we just want to be present with God as someone we love. You know, it's a friendship. We said last time, like just like an older couple, that maybe they don't have to be always talking or doing things together. They may be happy to just sit together on a park bench or whatever. So, or just doing things together without saying a lot about it. You know, can be it can be a very deep expression of their love. So far, so good.
And
So
one last one.
Okay.
Rita asks, are there recognized Carmelites who have a strong devotion to Brother Lawrence?
Well, I mean, Conrad de Meester, I would say. Others, I think it's interesting because, as I say, and I'll explain again a little bit in a moment, that he has been known better outside the Carmelites and outside the Catholic Church than by Carmelites and by Catholics for various historical reasons. But I think those who know him and who familiarize themselves with him really find him helpful. So, I mean, I know some Carmelites, like in my own community, we have the Father Sal who translated our edition of Brother Lawrence, and I think he finds that very important for his spirituality too.
One last question.
Okay.
This is from Francis, and Francis asks, could this prayer practice of the presence of God be seen in a similar parallel to Saint Teresa's fourth mansion, when the senses, intellect no longer have their pull on you, and now finally you can be with God all the time?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say maybe that's what it's aiming at, but as he says at the beginning, I mean, you may still be wrestling with all those. I mean, you can start, you can use this prayer at any point in the spiritual journey, I think, but it just, you need to be working on building up the habit. So if you're a beginner who's using practice of the presence of God, you're not yet at the fourth mansion and so on, but this is going to help you get there, I think. And again, I don't think Brother Lawrence means this as, although it sounds like it from what he says, that this would be the only kind of way of praying that one does. Because, as I say, he's a member of religious order. They have liturgy. They have other kinds of prayers they do in common and so on. And I'm sure Brother Lawrence was expected to participate in all of those. So I mean, I mean, obviously Catholics. I mean, we have the Eucharist, we have liturgy of the hours, we have all the other prayers that we say and so on. But this is a good thing for doing, throughout the day. Whether, when we're not even formally praying, we can continue practicing the presence of God. Does that make sense to people? Okay, let me go on with it. I have a rather brief conclusion, and then maybe we can have a little bit of prayer time, and we'll see how things go from there. Let me go to screen share again. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about people like Archbishop Fenelon and Madame Guyon and so on. What happened in the 17th century, by the end of the 17th century, there had been a condemnation of quietism, and then a condemnation of what was called semi-quietism, which was had to do with the way that people understood Archbishop Fenelon and Madame Guyon to be pushing this idea of pure love of God without any concern for our own salvation and so on. Quietism was more the idea that, well, since God is in control, then basically we don't have to intervene with any activities of our own. We just let God do all the work. And I mean, the objection to that is no, even though it's true, everything is good as a grace of God, we have to put in the effort for spiritual growth and so on. And God will use that. We can't just coast to holiness. So when this condemnation of semi-quietism came out, I think it was like the late 1600s, like 1697 or sometime around there, that because Fenelon in his book called Maxims of the Saints had quoted people like, had quoted a number of the mystics and had quoted Brother Lawrence and so on, that, the Catholic world in France became uneasy then with reading these books, especially say someone like Brother Lawrence, because he wasn't a canonized saint. At least Teresa was canonized, and so presumably she's not a heretic. But Catholic spirituality, because of this concern about quietism, semi-quietism, and so on, tended to shift in the succeeding centuries to much more active forms of prayer. So for the most part, Catholics were encouraged to practice devotions, vocal prayers, discursive meditation, the kind of step-by-step prayer that we talked about before. If you got too much interested in mystical prayer, you wouldn't get a warm encouragement from your local pastor. I often mention a one woman years ago who told me that she went to the pastor in my parish and said, she felt she was being called to deeper prayer, to contemplative prayer, and the pastor basically told her, no, that's not for you. That's for Carmelite nuns. You go home and cook for your family and take care of the kids and so on, and leave that to the Carmelite nuns. So up until the beginning of the 20th century or so, Catholic spirituality was cautious about mysticism. And Lawrence was kind of under a cloud. But for that very reason, there were a number of Protestants who started looking into these authors, like Brother Lawrence and so on. I suppose the idea was, well, if the Catholics are condemning this, it must be pretty good. So just like when they try to condemn a book or a movie or something like that, then the people get interested in it. So what happened is Brother Lawrence really caught on among the Protestants. There are countless editions in English, in German, and so on. John Wesley of the Methodists was read Brother Lawrence, was very encouraging about him. This book I have here is this James Gall is a Protestant author and preacher and so on. You see, the lost art of practicing his presence includes the practice of the presence of God by Brother Lawrence. So I went to kind of a pretty conservative Baptist Bible missionary school, and they had a little bookstore there, and I saw Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection was there that practiced the presence of God, and I said, well, he was a Catholic. Oh, we didn't know that. So I don't know if they took him out of the bookstore, but and even beyond Protestantism, it's very interesting that nowadays you get those of other faiths writing about Brother Lawrence, because he doesn't get into dogmatic questions, doctrinal questions. He just is giving you a way of trying to remain aware of God's presence. So you have some of these, the kitchen saint and the heritage of Islam, comparing Brother Lawrence to Islam, or Brother Lawrence, a Christian Zen master, and so on. And these other editions are Protestant editions and so on. So Brother Lawrence, I think, still speaks to us today, and he promises that we can expect all those graces that he describes if only we grow accustomed to practicing the presence of God. Now, I have some discussion questions here. Just, well, you could, if we don't talk about it here, we can think about it later. But as I say, first one, early in his religious life, Lawrence is tormented by doubts about his salvation. What issues do we worry about, and how can we learn to let go and trust as he did? Lawrence says that practicing the presence of God is difficult at first, but it can become habitual. Are there new challenges and distractions today that make the practice difficult, and how might we deal with them? For example, if you're always looking at your phone and social media and so on, how does that, does that interfere with trying to be aware of the presence of God? What do you find attractive in Brother Lawrence's message? What's less appealing? What do you wish he had said more about? And why do you think Brother Lawrence is so popular outside the Catholic Church and even outside Christianity? Well, I sort of tried to answer that. He speaks to people, I think. You'll see this when we post the PowerPoint. I mean the Zoom recording. But if you want the fullest edition of Brother Lawrence, we have the one that was translated from the critical edition at ICS Publications, and you can see that's their website, icspublications.org. I'm not saying you have to buy that one. You can find all kinds of editions, but it has a bit more material if you're interested in a very long introduction and so on. I don't know if I'm actually going to play this song at the end, but it was one that I liked a lot, and it spoke to me about God's presence when I was in Kenya. So now you've seen it on the recording. If you want to listen to it and we don't do it here, you can listen to it later. Okay. And good. Are there any more questions?
One came in from Rita. She asks, are there any aspirative prayers that are of the Carmelite spirituality and are available to us today?
Distinctively Carmelite. My sense is Carmelites just use whatever works for them. I think now these are the Ocarms, but there's a Carmelite mystic called John of St. Sampson who he talked a lot about aspirative prayer, and he may have recommended some particular ones, but I'm not sure which ones he recommended. So I don't know that there's a particular Carmelite one, but I think we're open to any one that works for you. Other questions?
No other questions.
Okay, well, I thought we might end with a little prayer. And then if there's still time, I can see if I can play that recording. But this is a couple of texts from Brother Lawrence and then a final prayer. From Brother Lawrence. We do not always have to be in church to be with God. We can make of our hearts an oratory where we can withdraw from time to time to converse with him there, gently, humbly, and lovingly. Everyone is capable of these familiar conversations with God, some more, some less. He knows what we can do. Neither fitness nor learning is required to approach God, only a heart resolved to devote itself exclusively to him and to love him alone. Remember, I beg you, what I recommended to you. That is, to think of God often, night and day, in all your activities, and even when you relax. He is always near to you and with you. Do not leave him alone. You would consider it rude to leave a friend who is visiting you by himself. Then why abandon God and leave him alone? Do not forget him. Think of him often. Adore him continually. Live and die with him. This is the true occupation of a Christian. In a word, this is our trade. If we don't know it, we must learn it. And this is the closing prayer from a book called The Practice of the Presence of God. Well, I'll show you when I turn off my background here. Sorry. 1 second here. You can see I'm not really sitting outside. From a book called Practicing the Presence of God, a Retreat with Brother Lawrence, which again is I think it may be out of stock right now, but it was published by ICS Publications. Your Son, O God, is the same yesterday and today and forever. He is your facet, and I want to see him again and again in every aspect of my life. Help me to see him in the blue sky, the green mountain, and the blooming flowers. Help me to see him in the lonely, the distressed, the ill, the outcast, the broken, and the abused. Help me to see him in the events and circumstances that occur. Help me to live in total presence of you as you are totally present in the here and now. Help me to make of my prayer a life-giving relationship and not only a religious practice. Help me to be a new person, and a new world will emerge because you make all things new. God, my God, you are a now God. Everything is present to you. Help me to live your life. Help me to be your presence to the world. Amen. Very good. And thank you for being with us this evening. And yes, someone, I see a comment there about living in the present moment. There's another Jesuit spiritual author called De Caussade. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but he talks about the sacrament of the present moment. So I had one final song. This may seem a little strange, and I'm not sure it'll work. Last time nobody could hear the sound, but it comes from my time when I was in Kenya for 12 years. And it's a song, I chose it because you won't have heard it before. I don't think it's in Swahili, but it's you will see if you can see it, you'll see the lyrics, the English translation of the lyrics. It's by a singer named Rebecca Dawn. She's the daughter of missionaries. She's lived her whole life there in Kenya, so that's why she knows Swahili. And there's also a very beautiful version of it by one of the school choruses there by a group called the Redford Chorus, which you'll be able to see. But let me see if I can get this to work. And again, though, you're free to go at any time you would like. If you don't like the song, you can just turn it off. So see if this will work.
We can't hear it, Father.
Okay. Okay, well then I'll you have the link in the I don't know why it did it all right the first time, but it's not doing it other times. But you have the link in the recording if you want to look at slide all the way to the end of the recording, and you'll see the link there that you could use if you're interested. But you're not obliged to like my taste in music. So next week we'll be looking at Saint Therese, and I hope to see some of you again for Therese. So thank you all very much, and thank you for your patience. And we'll be posting the link for this. I think certainly on the Center for Carmelite Studies website, so you can look for it there if you Google Center for Carmelite Studies activities. So good night, one and all, and have a blessed evening.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Praise be Jesus Christ.
Now and forever.
Thank you so much, Father.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Father.
Thanks. Yeah. LJ, do we need to talk at all, or?